Of all the foes Rome faced, rebellious legions, invading barbarian hordes, rival empires, few entities provoked such a meticulously calibrated and psychologically intricate response as a captured queen. Her defeat on the battlefield was merely the prelude. Her true value to Rome began the moment she was taken alive. She was not a standard prisoner of war to be ransomed, enslaved, or summarily executed. She was something far more potent and perilous, a sovereign idea made flesh, a walking, breathing testament to the possibility of authority, legitimacy, and loyalty existing entirely outside the Roman framework. Rome's subsequent treatment of these women was never a simple act of vengeance or even justice. It was a cold, systematic, and multi-stage process of ideological dismantling, a state-sponsored project aimed at deconstructing a rival system of power and using its most visible symbol to teach an unforgettable lesson about the absolute nature of Roman order. This process, which unfolded over months or even years, moved deliberately from spectacular public humiliation to protracted psychological erosion and finally to silent obliteration, revealing an empire deeply confident in its military might, but profoundly anxious about the stories that could outlast it. The first phase, beginning at the very instant of capture, was one of logistical and symbolic recalibration. A queen was immediately recategorized from sovereign enemy to high-value political asset. This was not a promotion, it was the beginning of her reduction. Her transport to Rome was conducted with a careful clinical efficiency. Guards ensured her survival not out of mercy, but to preserve the integrity of the impending lesson. She was a delicate piece of evidence, and evidence must arrive intact for the trial of reputation to proceed. During this journey, the machinery of Roman propaganda began its quiet work. Her titles were ignored in official dispatches. She was referred to as the captive woman or the barbarian leader. This linguistic stripping was the initial crucial step in divorcing her person from her office. The delay itself was a weapon. Unlike a slain warrior king whose death could be immediate and heroic, the captured queen entered a limbo of uncertainty. Weeks or months might pass with no word of her fate. This silence was a vacuum into which rumor and fear rushed, amplifying her helplessness and Rome's implacable control. For the empire, this period was one of strategic flexibility. Her living presence offered options, a bargaining chip for future treaties, a deterrent to remaining partisans, or the centerpiece for a coming spectacle. She was not yet a person. She was a variable in a political equation. That spectacle was the triumph, Rome's masterclass in the theater of conquest. To modern sensibilities, a triumph might suggest a celebratory parade. In reality, it was a highly ritualized and brutally didactic drama of domination, and the captured queen was its most critical supporting actor. The event was a vivid tableau of Roman world order. At its head rode the triumphant general, painted in vermilion, draped in purple, embodying Jupiter-like authority and Roman virtue. Behind him snaked the spoils of war, chests of plundered treasure, wobbling towers of captured arms, exotic animals, and lines of bound, defeated soldiers. And among them, carefully positioned, walked the queen. Her appearance was meticulously stage-managed to maximize contrast and cultivate contempt. She was often forced to wear the full, elaborate regalia of her former station, the crowns, gowns, and jewels that had once symbolized her authority. But now these items were not marks of power, they were costumes of absurdity, emphasizing her alien, non-Roman nature. The glittering crown atop her head as she shuffled in chains did not speak of majesty, it screamed of pretension humbled. The crowd, orchestrated by the very scenery, understood its role. They did not see a fallen head of state, they saw a bizarre curiosity, a living illustration of the chaos that preceded Roman order. The message was visual and unequivocal. This is what happens to power that does not emanate from Rome. It becomes a parade float. Sometimes the lesson was sharpened further by the forced inclusion of her children. Their presence beside her in bonds was a statement of devastating finality. Rome was not merely defeating a current ruler, it was extinguishing a bloodline, annexing the future itself. The triumph's cruelty was not in the physical suffering it inflicted, though the march was arduous, in its psychological alchemy. It transformed a political adversary into a public spectacle, a sovereign into a souvenir. By the time the procession wound its way to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, her role was complete. She had been used as a living prop to reenact before the entire city the empire's foundational narrative. Civilization vanquishing chaos, order subsuming ambition, Rome rewriting reality. For some queens, the triumph marked the end, but for many, it was merely the end of the first act. Rome understood that a spectacular public death could crystallize a ruler into a martyr, a potent symbol around which resentment could coalesce for generations. Therefore, the empire often opted for a more protracted and, in its view, more effective punishment, allowing her to live. This was not an act of clemency, but a strategic calculation of controlled irrelevance. Survival became a cage more confining than any dungeon. These women were typically placed under a form of genteel house arrest, confined to a guarded villa, a temple precinct, or a comfortable but isolated residence in an Italian town. On the surface, it appeared civilized, even merciful, but this apparent comfort was the essence of the punishment. The prison was not made of iron bars, but of silence, routine, and the systematic eradication of purpose. Every element of her former identity was surgically removed. She was cut off from her advisors, her people, any correspondence that might remind her or others of her past authority. She was maintained, fed, and clothed, but she was no longer a participant in her own life. She was an object under observation. The true torment was the weaponization of time and uncertainty. She was rarely told what her ultimate fate would be. Would she be quietly executed in a year? Would she live out her days in this quiet oblivion? The empire offered no answers. Days bled into months, months into years, in a featureless landscape of waiting. For a mind accustomed to command, to making decisions that shaped the destinies of thousands, this void of agency was a special kind of torture. Rome had mastered the art of psychological erosion. It understood that stripping a person of their future, of any horizon to look toward, was more corrosive than any physical pain. She existed in a permanent present, a museum of her own defeat, preserved to prove a point that grew more obscure with each passing season. This prolonged limbo also served the Rome's strategic political goals. A living, subdued queen was a powerful tool for pacification. Should unrest stir in her former lands, Roman diplomats could casually remark, "Your queen is still our guest." The implied threat was suffocating. Her continued existence, known but powerless, acted as a lid on the pot of rebellion. Furthermore, her prolonged captivity allowed Roman culture and historiography to do its slow, insidious work. As she faded from public view, Roman writers began the process of narrative reassignment. The competent military strategist was recast in the annals as an impulsive, emotional woman driven by hubris. The popular, legitimate ruler became a tragic figure whose people were misled. Rome's historians, like its engineers, were builders. They constructed a version of events where her defeat was not just a military outcome, but a moral and logical inevitability. The living queen, isolated and voiceless, could offer no rebuttal. And the end finally came. It was typically as quiet and administrative as her imprisonment had been. There were no more crowds, no dramatic final speeches on the scaffold. After years of silence, Rome would often dispatch an executioner to her residence. The method was usually discreet, strangulation or poison, designed to leave no mess, physical or symbolic. The goal was a storyless death. A public execution risked reigniting memory and sympathy. A private, administrative killing was merely the closing of a file. Her body was disposed of without ceremony. The news, if it was announced at all, was a bureaucratic footnote. The empire had already extracted every ounce of utility from her. Her humiliation in the triumph had taught the masses. Her long captivity had deterred her people. Her erasure from history was now being finalized. Her physical death was the last minor logistical step. The final and perhaps most complete stage of punishment was erasure from memory, a task entrusted not to soldiers or executioners, but to poets, historians, and senators. Rome sought a victory that was not just territorial or political, but historiographical. It aimed to control not only what happened, but how it would be remembered for all time. The queen's name was misspelled, minimized, or omitted. Her achievements were attributed to luck, to the counsel of inevitably treacherous men, or to Roman magnanimity. Her resistance was framed not as a principled stand for independence, but a kind of natural disorder, like a storm, that the inevitable force of Roman order was destined to calm. In this rewritten history, she was often caricatured through a distinctly Roman lens. Traits that might have been seen as leadership, decisiveness, charisma, strategic daring, were pathologized as masculine ambition, irrational passion, or cunning deceit. Roman authors, writing for a Roman audience, consistently portrayed these women as exceptions that proved the rule being that stable, legitimate governance was the exclusive domain of Roman-style administration, led by men. By systematically dismantling her posthumous reputation,